On this Friday, September 27th, pleased to welcome back live Admiral James Stavridis, who is the former Allied Supreme Commander of NATO, just a regular weekly guest on this show. And Admiral, welcome back. I know you've been globetrotting. I want to cover three things with you. Your visit to Saudi Arabia, what the E3 did about Iran this week, and then your time in Ukraine when you were the Supreme Allied Commander. So I got to parcel my time quickly. Can you first tell us about what you saw when you were in Saudi Arabia? I think it was there. You were there after the attack by Iran on Saudi Arabia.
Hugh, I actually landed as the drones hit, and off in the distance you could sort of feel the thunder, and I knew at that moment this was going to be a huge event. I mean, this is the center of gravity of the global oil industry, and certainly I would say that immediately you got a sense in Saudi Arabia of extreme seriousness, of extreme nervousness. I had a chance to meet with several of the cabinet ministers. They are 100% focused on this, and it's an existential threat to the Saudis. So they are looking for U.S. support. I think the administration is making a smart move, sending some troops over there to kind of calm the situation a bit, but it's another indication of how dangerous this is in the Middle East, and you and I have been talking about it for months.
Now, Admiral, it was my reading that the Saudi defenses had been built to protect against attacks from Yemen, but these came from a different direction, widely believed to have been from southern Iran. Are there, for example, Patriot missile batteries that can be deployed to protect that flank of the Saudi complex?
Absolutely, and the Patriot is in place around the perimeter of many of these oil fields. But the problem is, Hugh, these drones are smaller, lighter, quicker. When combined with cruise missiles, they can also create a saturation effect. And frankly, the oil fields need to be rebalanced in a military sense so they can protect against what I have called the new strategic triad, which is unmanned vehicles, cyber, and special forces. That's really the threat to these oil fields, not these big lumbering cruise missiles.
Now, in terms of the president's response to date, which has been diplomatic, not kinetic, do you believe we are outside of the zone where a kinetic response is likely, or are we still in that zone?
We are out of the zone for the moment, and observe that the Iranians have been quite careful, actually, not to attack any U.S. personnel. There have been no U.S. deaths here. And to my knowledge, there have been no Saudi deaths here. So the Iranians are moving quite cautiously, making kinetic attacks against tankers, against the oil fields. Where we ought to worry, Hugh, in terms of a kinetic response is if the Iranians cross that line. If there's American troops killed, or there are mariners killed, or Saudis killed in the oil field, I think that's a different ballgame. The Iranians haven't gone there yet.
Right now, Admiral Stavridis, in the superheated greenhouse of Washington, D.C., some things get missed. I was in New York yesterday. The UN saw an amazing thing this week. The E3, United Kingdom, Germany, and France, came towards us vis-a-vis Iran. I think that's the most important story of the week. What do you think about it?
I totally agree. And unfortunately, it did get buried under everything happening in Washington. This is a big deal. This is what we've been waiting for. I've often referred to the UK, Germany, and France as the swing voters in this relationship between the U.S. and Iran. Heretofore, those three have maintained faith, if you will, with the broken agreement for denuclearizing Iran. Now, at the UN, because of the attacks on the Saudi oil fields, all three of them have said this is unacceptable. We will join the United States to put diplomatic pressure on. For the first time, I can see a diplomatic path forward because of this. It's a huge story.
All right, now, in terms of that, how does that manifest next? They kept a little wiggle room. They hedged their bets a little bit, but do we expect them to formally withdraw from the JCPOA and say start over? Because they said sort of two things. One of those was come talk about long-range missiles, the export of terror, regional instability, but maybe the JCPOA isn't dead yet. Well, I think it's dead, but maybe they just don't want to do it diplomatically.
It is dead, and it's a tired debate about whether it was a good deal or a bad deal. Doesn't matter. It's a dead deal. So at this point, you got to play the ball from where it is on the field. I think Macron, the president of France, is the leader in that troika and is going to push it forward. Hopefully we'll see Brexit resolved one way or the other. That'll get the distraction of Brexit off the plates of the Brits. And then I think you'll see the next British government, whoever it is, lean in. That's the moment to watch. So I think late October, early November, hopefully Brexit in the rearview mirror. At that point, watch for the troika to completely break with the old deal and come to the negotiating table to pressure Iran. That's the only path forward here.
Now, let me switch to your time as Supreme Allied Commander, 2009 to 2013. I think you had left before the protests in Kiev in November of 2013. I know you were gone when Russia invaded in 2014. But can you give us a sense? I assume you traveled to Ukraine. You've been everywhere, right? Like 35 different places in Ukraine. What a mess of a country. It is hard to follow this between 4 different prosecutors, 3 different presidents, a bunch of different scandals. What was Ukraine like when you were the Allied commander in charge of NATO?
You know, it was actually relatively hopeful in the sense that it was a Ukraine that was not invaded by Russia. There was certainly always a bubbling sense of problematic behavior by Russia trying to intrude. And you may not know this, Hugh, but the Russian Black Sea Fleet, even in those days, was actually stationed on Ukrainian soil. And so it was a complex relationship, but therefore the Ukrainians just wanted to be with NATO and wanted to be with the United States. Certainly plenty of corruption floating around, and that was what we tried to do in the military zone, was drive the corruption out. But we saw the Ukrainians deploy forces to Afghanistan with us. They sent a ship on counter-piracy missions. They're a capable, proud people who are just being beaten by a bully in the form of Vladimir Putin. We had to continue to work with them and stand with them, and that's something I'm very proud of in my time at NATO, is building that military relationship and ensuring that the Ukrainians got the support they needed. My successors following the invasion have continued that same track. Ukraine is a vital country in Europe. It's not a NATO member, but it's strategically vital.
Tell me how you would try and fight back against this shadow of corruption. We are focused on their oil and natural gas company right now as having untoward influence in America. We're focused on who got who fired and why and what Zelensky said to President Trump. But if you're running a combined arms campaign such as NATO, how do you keep the people with briefcases of cash from the door?
Well, it's the old line, send money, guns, and lawyers. And it's actually true. What you want to do in the military context is get your military lawyers talking to the legal teams of the Minister of Defense, the legal teams of the military operators, and showing them what's okay and what's not okay. You do want to send guns because that's your motivation. You want to send that military aid, so you have to have that capability. And certainly you've got to ensure that you have the ability to leverage them, show them what's right, and then you can, in fact, go to the Ukrainians, for example, and say, we have got to see an appropriate use of the aid we are sending you and show us where that aid went. That's entirely legitimate. In fact, it's required by law. So the military has a role in anti-corruption. We've done that, Hugh, not only in Ukraine, but in, for example, Central America, in Colombia, in Afghanistan. And there are varying degrees of success. I'll close by saying the one-star officer who headed the anti-corruption campaign in Afghanistan for me was named H.R. McMaster. I wonder
No
what
kidding.
happened to him. Yeah.
Now, did you deal with, I want to say his name correctly, Yanukovych? Did you deal with Yanukovych at all?
Yes, I met him, interestingly, years earlier when I was serving as Chief of Staff to Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld. And we went to Ukraine and had a meeting with Yanukovych, who is a THUG thug. And he is, in his dacha in Moscow now, and I don't think he's coming back anytime soon. I like this President Zelensky. I think he is a breath of fresh air in that country, and I am cautiously optimistic if we stay with Ukraine, we can help them push back on what's happening in southeastern Ukraine. The one thing that's lost forever, in my view, Hugh, is Crimea. That's not going to come back.
Well, I agree with that, and indeed, Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine. Am I
Exactly.
correct? And so that
You are.
was historically part of Imperial Russia, and though
Absolutely.
it's
And
illegitimate
also,
to use force, but it was certainly not a reversion to something that wasn't a norm for centuries.
that's exactly right. And we ought to remember pre-invasion, the population of Crimea was 80% plus Russian, very supportive of Russia. When I traveled in Crimea as opposed to the rest of Ukraine, you really got to feel that you weren't so much in Ukraine, you were really in a part of Russia. And so I think it's a fait accompli. It's illegal under international law. We ought to condemn it, but realistically, that's not going to get reversed, in my view.
Now, Admiral Stavridis, this is a very difficult question. It took about 5 years after Tiananmen massacre for America and China to get back to normalcy. We're now about 5 years out after the use of illegitimate force to seize Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine. Is there a rule of history about how long civilized countries punish via sanctions? I don't want to lift the Russian sanctions. I'm just curious if your study of history has revealed a rule under which the world generally adjusts to the reality even after its outrage real has been expressed.
I think there's a tactical answer and a strategic answer. I think tactically it probably is about 5 years. That's kind of the cycle of these kinds of things. But I think strategically there are places where the United States, for example, has imposed sanctions on Cuba for decades and decades and decades following a revolution there. So I think if it's a tactical event, a Tiananmen Square, I think that is probably a 5 to 7 year cycle. If it is a regime that is repugnant, like Cuba or North Korea, I think sanctions can go on for decades, and they should.
Last question. Is the Ukrainian military run by professionals or is it run by politicos?
It's run by professionals. Interestingly, many of them were initially trained in the old Soviet Union, although that generation is now bleeding out, and you're starting to see colonels and one-star generals who have served in NATO and been part of the NATO Ukraine operation. So uniformed military, pretty professional, got to stay on them, send money, guns, and lawyers, but stay focused on it, and that can be part of solving the corruption issues in Ukraine.
Admiral James Stavridis, always a pleasure. Thank you, Admiral. Coming right back, America, with Sonny Bunch. Time for the movies, but first.